Okay, so good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you may be in the world. Welcome to the seventh and sadly the final lecture, at least in this series of Decolonizing Global Health, hosted by Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, the Science, Technology and International Affairs program, as well as the Center for Global Health Science and Security. We are joined in the Zoom room today by a number of Georgetown students who will be able to ask questions of the speaker at the end of the session. For those of you joining live via YouTube, please post your comments or questions in the comment section, and we'll try and get to them in the discussion as well if there's time. So over the course of the last 2 months now, we've heard from a diverse variety of speakers, all thought leaders in their respective fields, commenting on different aspects of what it means to decolonize global health and the critical importance of doing so, really in order to advance global equity as well as the field of health itself. We've seen how inequities in global health can manifest at the individual, the institutional, and even the health systems levels, as well as governance. And also how these inequities have been both caused by and maintained by colonialism and its legacies. Today, in wrapping up this series, we take this journey one step deeper into our very psyches to understand how concepts of mental health and well-being have been affected by patterns of colonial power. And also what these outcomes mean, not just for decolonizing ourselves, but also the institutions to which we belong. And particularly those who are trying to implement systemic change to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. In doing so, we are extremely lucky to have an expert with us, both on the history of medicine and of mental health in particular, but also with deep investment in issues of race, gender, and equity. So Dr. Bhattacharya has received her PhD in the history of science from Harvard University in 2013, based on her research, which examined the genealogy of mental health in the British Empire, and specifically what it means to be simultaneously colonized by the state and by medicine. She's an award-winning teacher at Harvard, MIT, and Northeastern, among others. And is currently the director of Inclusion Boston, which is a program run by the YW Boston that helps organizations create the necessary cultural shift to support inclusive policies and practices. Prior to this role, Dr. Bhattacharya was heavily involved in the University of Pennsylvania's MSTP, which is a program designed to diversify the physician-scientist community in Philadelphia and beyond, and previously served as the director of Harvard University's International Program, managing incoming students' immigration status, funding, and curriculum development against a backdrop of increasing state violence and xenophobia. So before I hand over to Dr. Bhattacharya, I want to provide our usual reminder that we are all on a path of learning. The topics we are discussing for advancing equity and justice are important, but not always comfortable. Meaningful change rarely comes from a place of comfort, and our good intentions will only get us so far. So I encourage us all to lean into that discomfort, any discomfort that we may experience, while practicing the gifts of empathy and grace, as we are all on different points in our journey of learning. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn over to Dr. Bhattacharya for her lecture on Decolonizing the Mind, Systemic Change in Psychiatry and the Academy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Stanley. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Bear with me for 1 second. Wonderful, I think you can now see my screen. So indeed, Dr. Stanley is correct. I am the director of the Inclusion Boston program at YW Boston. And what that means is I create curricula that teaches organizations, be they corporate investment firms, architecture firms, startups, schools, cross-country nonprofits. I teach them how to bolster what we call their strategic planning through organizational change for greater equity. I like to call myself a recovering academic. As Dr. Stanley mentioned, I have degrees from Cambridge University in the UK, as well as a tiny little school just north of Boston in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And my work has by and large considered the non-medical community who inform medical and especially psychiatric practice. I tend to argue about the sociality of a physical institution, and that even when you see the double-edged sword of colonialism and medicine, which itself has a sort of additive system of oppression, the daily practice of medicine must and has to incorporate all kinds of people in order to function. These are the folks who get overlooked in our histories, and that's often because of our white supremacist commitment to the written word. If these folks don't produce documents, we as historians can't find them, and therefore they don't exist. And that means the historiography can either see them or not. They either are our historical actors with their own stories, or they never were. And so my work has allowed me to teach and speak at a number of institutions. Dr. Stanley gave the rundown, and essentially I've been able to build on my privileges as a middle-class cisgender English-speaking woman by adding Oxbridge and Ivy League degrees that open even more doors to me. So the question I often get is, why did you leave the academy? Today's talk tries to answer that question in a way that's more useful to you, that formulates a new question. And so the question I want you to ponder is, what does it mean to inherit colonial legacies of rationality? And how do we use this knowledge to affect change? So I'll start with psychiatry, which really is my bread and butter. Efforts to decolonize psychiatry have existed as long as the discipline itself. While efforts to treat and engage with the insane have been around for centuries in different parts of the world, it is telling that the term psychiatry is only coined in 1808 during the height of European colonization. After the success of the York Retreat, and that's the picture you can see right here of the retreat at York in England, Daniel Tuke, who was an expert on insanity, wrote that the liability to mental disease is greater in a civilized and thinking people than in tribes. Essentially, there was this concern that Europeans were increasingly coming into contact with non-Europeans. And it was at this point of contact that Europeans were liable to go mad. So madness was the price that European colonists paid for bringing their civilizing into the colonial setting. Thus, as a profession, psychiatry was founded on the belief that the white psyche was vulnerable to the psyche of the other. Indeed, to be white was to be civilized and thinking. To be not white was therefore to be unthinking, uncivilized, pathological. Initially, psychiatric institutions appeared in the colonies to treat these very white psyches. The East India Company, for example, was much more concerned about its soldiers and its civilian subjects who went mad in the heat than they were about those that they were colonizing. The only cure was to remove them from public, to put them into asylums like the one you see on the screen now, which was an asylum in Madras in India. Consequently, the East India Company would claim that it was treating these folks, but actually what they were doing was safely removing them from public life, thereby removing the embarrassment of having to explain why these white British officers were engaging in promiscuous behavior, such as consorting with local women, speaking in the vernacular, and going native. Soon after, though, the first psychiatric hospitals for colonized people were established in India. These native lunatic asylums, as they were called, emerged out of a much longer history of asylum reform that I'm not going to go into today. But essentially, they represented the aspirations of Britain to be seen as a benevolent overlord. The success of institutional care in Britain was slowly being transported to the rest of the world as an imperial sign of success. British medicine, British psychiatry, these were all part of the imperial mission, and not unlike the religious missionary in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the native asylum was not really a colonial institution, but a British institution being transported into the colony. And we can think about what that meant. So for example, you can see in this lunatic asylum in Burma, which was then part of British India, these are gardens that are created that are meant to represent the English countryside. We have these beautiful landscaped paths. We have a clear set of buildings that are divided into wings. It's meant to come across as a stately English home. Throughout the 19th century, and without any real consensus among the mind sciences, these kinds of colonial institutions actually lacked a lot of codification. So if psychiatry was the treatment of white psyches in colonial settings, what does it mean to be treating Indian psyches, who are by definition insane because they're not white? Without a coherent psychiatric doctrine for treatment, these asylums were run mainly by the Indian staff rather than the British officers who were hired to oversee them. So that means the janitors, the cleaners, the cooks, they were all recruited from the local community. The British medical officers and superintendents often looked to their staff to tell them what madness even meant in the colony. And this history of everyday life in the Indian asylum shows us how rich and complex mental health was before psychiatry codified itself into particular labels and categories. So for example, in an asylum in Patna in northwest India, we see that the Indian chefs who used to cook for the entire institution often gave recommendations to the British superintendents about using various spices or different foodstuffs in order to alleviate and treat patient symptoms. Similarly, the janitors, the waiting staff in other asylums would recommend things like prayers from their specific village, or ideas about how to tend the garden, or ideas about what kind of room, what kind of space the patients should be in. These ideas weren't coming from the discipline of psychiatry, they were coming from the locale, they were coming from people's homes and the spaces that they occupied. With the success of these asylums, the British end up exporting a model of colonial psychiatry across the world into places like East Africa and Australia. This coincided, however, with the codification of psychiatry as a profession at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And so the colonial asylums that you see in the early 20th century looked very different to these sort of hybrid collaborative asylums that existed briefly in 19th century India. And it wasn't just the British Empire that was navigating what madness meant for its colonial and colonized subjects. Various governments and state officials became concerned about another population, and that was their soldiers. So thanks in part to a variety of developments in the history of medicine in the 19th century, things like bacteriology and germ theory, soldiers in the war were actually surviving in much greater numbers. They were injured, sure, but they weren't dying. There were fewer fatalities. And these soldiers exhibited certain kinds of personality traits that required attention. What doctors began to call Kriegsneurose or war neurosis were basically shell shock or trauma under other names. And these were behaviors that the state had never seen before in these spaces. So here's a quote from one of the doctors who was reporting from the battlefield in 1914 during the First World War. He writes, "The big artillery battles of December 1914 filled our hospitals with a large number of unscathed soldiers and officers presenting with mental disturbances. From then on, that number grew at a constantly increasing rate. At first, these soldiers were hospitalized with others, but soon we had to open special psychiatric hospitals for them. Now, psychiatric patients make up by far the largest category in our armed forces. The main causes are the fright and anxiety brought about by the explosion of enemy shells and mines and seeing maimed or dead comrades. The resulting symptoms are states of sudden muteness, deafness, general tremor, inability to stand or walk, episodes of loss of consciousness, and convulsions. So imagine this: soldiers who are meant to represent the epitome of strength, of Western masculinity, of Western might. What does it mean for them to return from war shaking, unable to speak, scared and beaten down? It became very important to catalog these behaviors, not just to treat these shell-shocked soldiers, but to in some way create a prophylactic test to ensure that only the strongest of mind were permitted to join the army. And that's what I want to talk to you about now. The Bureau of the Census, the US Bureau of the Census, had already begun cataloging standard nomenclature of diseases and pathological conditions by the end of the First World War. They called this the standard. Although no single set of acceptable medical terminology really existed across the US at this point, larger hospitals like Bellevue and Allied Hospitals in New York, Mass General in Boston, and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore had begun forming something of a medical consensus. The US Bureau's standard did not get used by these larger hospitals. Instead, it was used by the US Army in the selection, assessment, and admission of its soldiers. As increasing numbers of colonial territories gained their independence in the first half of this 20th century, it becomes even more imperative to sustain a strong military. So to facilitate this, there was a committee headed by a psychiatrist brigadier rather, General William Menninger, to develop a new classification scheme. And this is what they called Medical 203. Issued in 1943, it was released as a technical bulletin under the War Department. Medical 203 did a sweeping revision of the earlier standard that the Bureau of Census had been developing earlier, and it accommodated certain governmental anxieties about the vulnerability of the state if its soldiers were predisposed to mental disturbance. So effective was Medical 203 as a tool for marking someone either fit or not for war, that its nomenclature was introduced into many clinics and hospitals by doctors returning from military duty after the Second World War. The American Psychiatric Association, for example, was so impressed, they sought a way to incorporate Medical 203 into some kind of general textbook for all psychiatrists. What they developed and published in 1952 is something that we call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. So the structure and conceptual framework of this new book were essentially the same as Medical 203. The passages of several passages of the text were identical. And while the DSM has evolved, I think it's expanded now into its 5th edition, it remains at its core a tool that was developed by the Army to denote whether your psyche renders you fit or not for war. As the globalization of the American psyche continues, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, this text, this Bible of psychiatry, continues to govern what it means to be mentally fit, healthy, or well. So with this colonial residue lingering in your minds, I want us to consider briefly also the histories of education that we are inheriting. So if you are enrolled in a US campus, and I know the students in the room certainly are, I want us to remember that that campus stands on Indigenous ground. I know that you were spoken to a few weeks earlier by Dr. Eli Nelson, who was thinking about Indigenous knowledge and public health. And today I want to add to this conversation by thinking about Indigenous assimilation. For us to be speaking English as a means of understanding knowledge is not arbitrary. There are many wonderful histories of education that I'm not going to go into right now, but I encourage you to read them. Jin Kyu Park writes about English fever in South Korea, Bhamari Nanaji Daga writes about English education in India, and actually there's a similar sort of track to follow in terms of Spanish education in Morocco by Sean Carlton. Today, I want to avoid parochializing the rest of the globe and actually focus on what it means for English to be the dominant language of knowledge here on Turtle Island, which we call in English, North America. So the English language, as many of you are probably aware, has been weaponized as a form of colonization, both here in the US and in several other countries and territories across the world. In the 19th century, Richard Henry Pratt initially wanted to absorb and assimilate prisoners of war as a means of rehabilitation. And what this meant was forced labor, dressing them in US military-style clothing, and of course, forcing them to speak only in English. He found that prisoners of war, as adults, tended to be resistant to his methods, and seeing as one of his cues was to kill any resistors, it meant that he couldn't necessarily see how well his pedagogical model was working. So while English was already being used in several reservation schools, Indian reservation schools, to assimilate them into sort of an American way of life, Pratt wanted complete assimilation. So in 1879, he established probably one of the most well-known of the off-reservation boarding schools. And this was the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And you can see on the screen right now, in 1884, a school photo that was taken of the Indigenous boys and girls who were at the school. I will not say that they attended the school because they never voluntarily went. Many of these children were stolen and coerced into attending. As headmaster of this school for 25 years, Pratt codified what it meant to belong to civilized US society, not just if you were a young Indigenous child, but also later if you were an immigrant to the US. By immersing young Indigenous children in boarding schools in white communities, Pratt believed you could kill the Indian, save the man. That was literally his motto. So what you see on your screen right now is a set of photos rather, that were taken before and then after a child had been coerced into attending one of these schools. And what you can see here is how their native cultural identity was violently removed. The long braids that Indigenous boys were cut off, although in a nod to the West's gender binary, the girls were allowed to keep their braids. You can see here that Thomas More was made to wear a standard uniform, very different from the clothing of his home. And he was also given a new name. Thomas More is not his real name. It was the name that he was given, a white name, as it was felt that in Christianizing them with new names, this would help maintain Pratt's educational efforts long after they graduated. And of course, more than this, students were themselves forbidden from speaking their native languages, even to each other. 350 such schools were created in response to the success of the Carlisle School. By 1900, this meant 20,000 children had been stolen from their families and forced into these schools. By 1925, this number was 60,000. What this means is that in less than half a century, 2, maybe 3 generations of Indigenous children had lost the ability to communicate with their families entirely. Many of them never returned home, even if they knew where that was. And also, any knowledge that they gleaned was only useful in an English-speaking community. Any awareness they had, any self-confidence they had in themselves was curated for an English as knowledge world. And these tactics, these kinds of schools, were expanded across other parts of the world too, in places like Australia and Canada, really anywhere that white settler colonialists wanted to usurp local stewards of the land. These schools did gain some disrepute. As you can imagine, a boarding school filled with Indigenous children who are struggling to make sense of the world because they've been stolen from their families are especially vulnerable to abuse. This abuse, whether physical, verbal, or sexual, these stories slowly expanded out into the very white communities in which the children are being asked to assimilate. Indigenous rights became important in the era of civil rights, although some of these schools actually continued through to the 1970s. The English as knowledge efforts didn't go away, though, with the disbanding of the schools. They actually found root in another social technology that you might be familiar with: the testing of English as a foreign language, or the TOEFL. So, just as these schools are being disbanded, the TOEFL is being developed. In 1962, the TOEFL was developed under the pedagogical philosophy that sameness, especially in language, was necessary for learning. The original test had 3 parts: reading comprehension and vocabulary, listening comprehension, and structure of written expressions. Once again, in a stark echo of Medical 203, the test was administered less as a means of some inherent proficiency or learning ability, and more as a means of assessing who could assimilate into an English-speaking environment. The test was developed by the Modern Language Association, or the MLA, which you might be familiar with if you are familiar with some of the citation styles that we use in higher education. Some of you may have had to take the TOEFL. As a test, it certainly evolved with the times, and it does look very different today from its original construction in 1962. But here's the kicker. Like the DSM, the TOEFL has traveled beyond the borders of the US to fundamentally shape education around the world. Since 1965, in fact, the TOEFL has been taken by 27 million students. So let's say, for example, if you were in Indonesia in the year 2000, you will have noticed that all Indonesian districts were mandated that year. Despite their significant Arabic-speaking population, they were mandated to have at least one public school offering a globally recognized curriculum in English. The standard of this English was determined by, you guessed it, success in the TOEFL. Moreover, it was found that the students who were successful tended not to be bilingual. They had lost their ability to communicate with their families back home in an effort to succeed at the TOEFL. In effect, the TOEFL continues the mission of Richard Henry Pratt in separating English speakers from their non-English speaking families and assimilating them into a very foreign country. So let's return to parochializing the US. It's one of my favorite things to do. If the effect of the TOEFL is to separate populations and reinforce the attributes or qualities of one, what does it mean for us in English-speaking campuses? What are we losing from the rich tapestry of students who come into higher education when we force them to only learn, consume, and think in English? We can ask the same question of psychiatry. The DSM has the power to delineate who has mental health and who does not, who is normal, who is pathological, who has access to health insurance, who does not. What are we losing? What do we overlook when the primary arbiter of mental health is a text that in its origins told us whether or not a 1950s American man was likely to come out of war without experiencing trauma? So whether the academy or the mind sciences, we are constrained by the colonial rule books that continue to shape our world. How then do we divest? Well, there are certainly systems and processes for institutional and behavioral change. We see them around us all the time. They all have their own philosophy. Some of them constitute the very name of the programs and the spaces that allow us to be speaking to each other today. The US Department of State describes foreign service as a means of supporting prosperity and advancing the interests of the US abroad. Global health, as you've been exploring through this lecture series, uses a very particular definition or definitions of globality to try to create social cohesion. What I have learned as a practitioner of change, because that's really what DEI is, diversity, equity, inclusion. It just means change. What I have learned is that divesting from any structures, be they physical or ideological, starts with identifying them. Anecdotally, this is when people say naming the problem is the first step to dealing with the problem, right? I want us to go further. Identifying isn't simply about naming. It isn't about using a hashtag or pointing the finger. Real identification requires learning the history, identifying the historical narrative. Because names change, right? The person who was responsible may leave, the offices may look different, things may expire, but the systems and the ideologies remain. The residues of policies are often far more insidious than their names alone. By recognizing the histories that you inherit, you are then empowered to change them. So this might be as simple as if you receive a diagnostic label from a doctor, knowing the history of where that label comes from allows you to offer alternatives that fit your reality rather than just the one that the doctor has learned. If there is a policy on campus that you disagree with, understanding the genealogy of that policy empowers you to find the right office to speak with and to then resituate that policy in a particular time. If you want to decolonize global health, learning about where these ideas of globality come from, learning about the evolution of these ideas, equips you to see who or what is excluded from your current working definition, and then either change the parameters of that definition or subvert them entirely. Too often, in an effort to be the first to make the intervention, the first to publish, the first to tweet, the first to call out or cancel something, we overlook the need for historical identification. And so I encourage you to take a lesson from what we do in sustainable DEI. And that's to remember that change takes time. Divestment and decolonizing systems does not happen overnight. But by identifying how we got the systems we have and recognizing our own complicity in them, that's the start of the change. So I'm not suggesting that you do what I did and leave the academy. Yes, this lecture was really all about me. No, I'm joking. But coming back to that original question I posed to you, I'm not telling you to leave these systems. You may and you should, and I hope you will, go on to be great global health leaders, foreign service officers, practitioners, psychiatrists, maybe even professors too. But I am asking you to consider the power you have while you're in these systems, the power to observe, identify, and learn their histories, so that if you choose to, you can indeed divest, change, and decolonize them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bhattacharya. So much to think about. So we've got a decent amount of time for questions, which is great. Maybe if you stop sharing your screen, you'll be able to see everyone's shiny, happy faces.
There we go.
There we go. And hopefully everyone will be able to see you and can raise their hand to ask questions. If anyone's sound is not working brilliantly, feel free to stick it into the chat as well, and we can moderate that way. Any questions to kick us off?
I don't bite, I promise.
She's very nice. Well, I can start one off just to get while people digest lecture. So I was just really struck by what you were talking about at the very beginning of the talk regarding the concept of mental illness as that vulnerability of the white person coming into contact with the other. And it seemed almost like another rephrasing of the white man's burden. It was like, this is what we have to suffer by bringing civilization to these people. But it's funny, I'd never heard of the white man's burden expressed in those terms. I just wonder if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. So really psychiatry in its etymology means treatment of the soul. And if you think about where Western rationality comes from, the idea is that the West have souls and others do not, right? So thinking about psychiatry as a treatment for the white man's soul, this comes about in the 19th century when many other treatments are being given to the white man because unfortunately for him, he has to deal with the world. Never mind if the world has to deal with him. So along the same lines of the fact that a white woman might be sent to actually asylums, right? They wouldn't be using the term psychiatry. They might talk about her hysteria. The white man, because of that need to sort of build up his soul, he would be sent on long walks in the wilderness. There was this idea that, you know, if the white man was feeling a certain way, was he feeling less than strong, the way you bolstered that was by returning him to something that made him feel manly again, that reabsorbed his sense of masculinity. And so that's where we're seeing the focus, even when you're building asylums in the colonies. Initially, it's not about the colonized subjects at all. Of course not. When the colonized subjects have prisons to go to if they're not behaving well. But the European medical officers, they are ending up, well, because of their promiscuous behavior, they are often put in these very genteel asylums. Often they were in like the foothills of the Himalayas, where you could see all of God's glory, so to speak. And this was meant to restore the medical officers from their initial doolally behavior when they were in the heat with the locals. And so we slowly see this idea transform. And that was really the kernel of my PhD work, was like, why on earth then start making these psychiatric institutions for the non-white if by default they don't have psyches that are vulnerable in the same way? And we see, therefore, the British Empire actually making a real effort in the 19th century to come across as a more benevolent colonial overlord. And that's why we see them build these colonial institutions for the natives, but they don't really have any treatments there, right? These are not asylums that are in the foothills. These are not treatments that are designed for the white man. They just have these spaces because they have, there's been a lot of asylum reform happening in Britain. And so they're like, we need to build these asylums for our colonized subjects, but we don't know what to do with them when they're there. More than that, even the superintendents who are put in charge of them, they have very little psychiatric training. Most of them that's just a stepping stone to some other higher position within the empire. So they are suddenly in charge of these psychiatric institutions filled by brown people, and they don't know what to do. So they're looking at their own staff and saying, well, what do you consider to be crazy? What do you consider to be mad? Because I can't tell the difference as a white man from Britain. I can't tell the difference between who should be in the asylum and who's outside my asylum. And that's where we see this really creative, collaborative way of thinking about mental health, because out of necessity, the medical officers have to rely on Indigenous knowledge. And it's only when psychiatry becomes more codified into the 20th century that space, that flexibility for sort of collaborative, permeable, hybrid mental health is sort of done away. And all of a sudden you see again, psychiatric labels, doctors, patients in rooms. So that's sort of the evolution of the white man's burden all the way through to these Indigenous psychiatric institutions.
Absolutely fascinating. And what a tragic missed opportunity for creating a much more holistic vision of mental well-being at that point in time, in that particular place at least. It may not have been transportable elsewhere, but probably could have avoided quite a lot of subsequent harm. Any other questions from the group while we're there? I thought it was so interesting also what you said about the going native as a sign of mental illness, and particularly the examples that you used of, using the vernacular and promiscuity. Even just a few weeks ago, we were talking about what it means to have authentic engagement, particularly people with privilege from high-income countries seeking to work with and in lower and middle-income countries. And those are exactly, maybe not the promiscuity, but certainly the vernacular part, learning the language, being part of the culture is now seen as such a key element of authentic engagement. And so maybe that's a hopeful sign that we've come at least some distance away from that past, but clearly huge distance to go as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the other issue with a lot of these labels, is that the labels tell us more about the society giving the label rather than the person receiving the label. At least that has been, by and large, the pattern in the history of psychiatry. So, again, I refer back to white women being called hysterical. They weren't hysterical, they just didn't fit into the existing understanding of how a white woman should or shouldn't be. And similarly, when we're seeing these European officers going native, basically hanging out with locals, eating local food, I'd say that's what you're meant to do when you're traveling, right? That was considered really quite unbecoming, because how can you then separate the colonizer from the colonized if the colonizer is engaging in exactly the same behaviors as the subjects being colonized? So it's really important to be able to draw those lines so that you can maintain your right to colonize an entire territory. If there's no difference between you and the people you're colonizing, it's very difficult to defend that.
Is there any way, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how people resisted colonialism through using kind of traditional, like, just ways of thinking and knowledge and community building, and resisted psychiatry as kind of in general. I think some of those narratives are important for students to think about.
Absolutely right. So I told the story of the big bad colonialists, and of course, there are several stories of resistance. One particular story is really to do with the populations that were in the asylums, even as they became more codified. You notice that, well, rather I noticed in my research, that the patients and the non-English speaking staff actually end up forming something of an alliance within the asylum. And that's not as simple as, I'm going to protect you from Dr. X. Rather, we notice that some of the patients actually escape, not for very long. And that's because they voluntarily return. And that's the only moment that you realize that they escaped. And you find out that the reason that they escaped was because the staff had sort of given them an opportunity to escape, to go and see their sister who was getting married, and then they allow the patient to return. And so there was a sense that even as the codification is occurring from top down, which is a very sort of Foucauldian way of understanding institutions, within the institution, the walls are still being broken down. People are taking advantage of networks, essentially, of the languages that they speak, the places that they go and move. They knew that the medical superintendents, even as they were in charge, they tended not to be doing the rounds, essentially, late at night. And so that was the time for them to make plans, to escape. And the patient who returns, he's asked why he returned. And he basically said, well, I get 3 meals a day and I don't have to do any work, so why wouldn't I? Which is quite an interesting story. In terms of sort of colonial psychiatry writ large in India, you do see a lot of practitioners, local practitioners, really making efforts to hide anyone who is considered mad by European standards. So even though these are not folks who would be considered mad by local understanding, the resistance is hiding them away from that medical gaze, that imperial gaze, because there was an understanding that if they were seen, they would be recognized as something pathological that didn't make sense to the locals, but certainly made sense to the colonizers. So they would be hidden, or they would be moved around. This is another reason why the British Empire got very upset about folks moving from town to town. There was a lot more sort of nomadic movement of people from different places. And so over time, you see the British actually developing a system where if you are not resident in a particular place, you have a penalty. And it's because they were doing things like moving from one town to another where they knew there was no asylum being built. Even when it comes to the building of an asylum, actually, There was also resistance in terms of redirecting funds away from a particular area. So if they knew that funds were going to a particular area to build up an asylum, because of the networks of information that existed in that particular area, they would often literally divert the mail so that folks couldn't find out about what was happening there. And so you see all these, they seem mundane, right? They seem like such small changes, but it demonstrates such an awareness of the power of a network, of the power of, I like to call it a local ecology, right? Understanding that there might be this sort of alien thing that's put in a space. If it doesn't cohere with the local ecology, there are ways to really rely and leverage that local ecology in order to resist it. And in many ways, that's kind of what I do in DEI as well, is to think about what is the local ecology, what are the networks that you already have, rather than starting new initiatives, what are the strengths you have as a group, and can you leverage that in some powerful way?
Madison, did you want to jump in with a quick question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, like, given how the creation of like psychiatry and psychology originally, but specifically like the military history of the DSM influenced the treatment of women, both like, you know, British women, but specifically like women living in the colonies, and whether that was really different from men living in that context.
So there's a sort of there's two sides to the coin here. You're absolutely right. When it comes to the patriarchy, the DSM is also very effective at bolstering certain gender binaries. However, initially, at least, the DSM doesn't seem to have as much of an effect on women in the colonies because the colonists respect the fact that women were often not meant to be in public spaces. So, and a lot of the asylums that I looked at, there are very few women actually resident in the asylums. If they are there, they don't have families. Every now and then you see some disgruntled husband bringing his wife to an asylum, and that's regardless of whether you're in the colonies or back in Europe. That technique is used to stigmatize the wife through mental health. But initially, at least in the colonies, you don't see as many women being brought up in front of the psychiatric gaze because there's still this very weird exoticizing understanding of women in the colonies. Slowly, however, and this coincides with increased decolonization throughout the 20th century, slowly you see more and more women in asylums, and they're usually the folks who are championing independence movements in some form or another. When it comes to the DSM in the US and in Europe, you start seeing similar efforts to flatten the lives that women have begun enjoying in the middle of the century. And so that means explaining away their desire to be in the workforce as saying that that's some kind of hysterical outpouring and prescribing medications for them. So a miltini is something that women in the US enjoyed, at least in the 60s and 70s. And this was a pill called Miltown that's essentially a strong antidepressant that was put into your evening martini. And women were actively encouraged to consume them because it meant that they would be able to create more peaceful homes for their husbands when they returned from work. And so there's this idea that instead of addressing that women wanted to be out in the workplace and they were frustrated that after the Second World War, they were being told to return home. Instead of dealing with that system, they were being prescribed antidepressants, essentially, to keep them docile in the home place. And you can actually go online and find Miltown advertisements. And this came out of the DSM's understanding of what a happy woman looks like. Any other questions?
Yeah, Shweta, I think you had one.
Yeah. So I found like your discussion of like divesting from the academy or any sort of institution to be really interesting. I think it's like especially, I guess, important for a lot of, I guess, the students in the room, because I think our education journeys are still progressing, and I think a lot of us see a future after undergrad in some sort of educational institution. And I think the thing that makes like me nervous, at least, I don't know if it's other people as well, is that by not kind of following the system until you get out of it, there might be like, you might not be considered as legitimate or credible or like have the credentials.
Mhm.
So but like I think it's like once you finish your education within the system and then like divest from it, I think that's different from being in the system and divesting when you're in the system itself.
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, do you have any advice for that second process, or would you recommend, like, instead of, if I'm, say, someone who's passionate about global health, instead of taking up some opportunity at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I choose to go to some non-Western institution in an area where I feel kind of interested in. Yeah.
I mean, yes, is the short answer to what you're saying. Absolutely. And that's really what I was trying to get at the end of the lecture is don't necessarily jump out of the academy like I did. In fact, you have much more power for change while you're in it. And that's because both you're seen by the institutions as one of their own, right? So you have the ears of many more than you would if you're outside it. But also because of exactly what you're getting at, which is you already have their attention and you already get to see the system, the structures, whether it's, you know that you have access with your student card to many buildings. Similarly, while you're still a student there, you have a sort of virtual access to many offices, spaces, and channels. And so that's where you can begin to make, I wouldn't call it noise, but you can certainly suggest change that's going to be heard differently. And if you are applying for grants to go and do research, right, you can show, rather than tell, you can show how useful it is to go to these other parts of the world that tend not to have their own initial funding. You can go to these other parts of the world, and when you're writing that report back to the institution or you're giving a presentation, all of a sudden, all the people in that room have a sort of awareness of how useful it is to be in those other parts of the world. Versus if I were a scholar from somewhere else, and I come and give a presentation to your global health center, I'm already seen as other. There's something that's very powerful about being of the institution and using those funds and that attention to sort of shine a light on these other parts of the world or these other institutions that are just as useful. But maybe because of the way, again, the history of how the funds have been developed, the offices have been developed, the departments have been developed, those haven't been the places in the world that have generally received that much attention. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of power that you have, and connecting with scholars as well, right? So let's say you are about to write a paper and it pertains to any part of the world while you're at the Center for Global Health Sciences. Think about who you can be collaborating with. Think about how powerful it is for you to be collaborating across institutions. That's great, right? We want you to publish. But for you to be connected on paper with a scholar from a different institution, specifically an institution that doesn't tend to have a lot of that attention and is not usually lauded. Like, there's a lot of power there. Think about who you invite to be on panels with you. Think about where they are, both in terms of the hierarchy of where they are, who they are, right? What body they inhabit, and where they are. Because by doing that, you're creating a network, which is wonderful. But also, again, you are expanding the lens that the institution uses to see these issues. So I hope that's helpful.
I think we have time for one final question, Jessica.
Yeah, I just had a question about the Anglo-Indian community in India.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, my family is all Anglo-Indian, and my grandpa has talked a lot about issues of alcoholism in the community. And I was just wondering if you could expand upon the mental health implications that have arisen directly because of British colonialism?
Absolutely, thank you. That's a really great question, right? That's the population that often gets overlooked in these discussions, because there's a sense of there's the colonizer and the colonized, and nothing in between. But yes, there's a huge population of Anglo-Indians, and prior to that, Dutch Indians, and Portuguese Indians, right? There's a lot of Euro-Indians in India throughout this period of time, and quite frankly, each of the governments do not know what to do with them, right? So I think that's why they initially get left out of the record, because they don't know how to categorize them. And so as historians, we tend to go with what's written. We often overlook them too. But you're absolutely right. They weren't considered European enough to be in a lot of the European institutions. So often they get ghettoized and siloed in terms of where they live and where they're treated and where they go to school. You often see Anglo-Indian schools being set up on the outskirts of military barracks. And that's because a lot of the sort of promulgation of Anglo-Indians occurred because of white British officers consorting with the local populations around them. And so schools actually form almost, you can see it's a very interesting architectural development. Anglo-Indian schools form around the military barracks. Then as the military leaves, this area doesn't have as much funding. And so what you see is that any services that were initially provided, whether it's schools, hospitals, tend to disappear. And that's where the conditions, the issues of lack of treatment really, really get increased. And so alcoholism certainly is something that was on, you can see sort of increases in rates after the military leave. You also see increasing rates of opiate uses, a number of different conditions that really demonstrate a last resort. There's no other access to healthcare. It's an effort really to medicate the self. That's where you see rising rates of addiction and alcoholism. And so, I mean, as you so eloquently put, there are multiple generations now who are descended from all of these Anglo-Indians. And so it's much more difficult now to draw the lines between who has Anglo-Indian blood and who doesn't. But a lot of the initial conditions that you spoke about, they're a result of the British pulling out funding and pulling out from certain institutions because they didn't recognize Anglo-Indians necessarily as one of their own, unless they had very, very fair skin, and unless the white parent was of a particular family or standing, in which case that's how you see a lot of Anglo-Indians actually ending up back in the metropole, right? In Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, because they come back and they go to boarding schools and essentially are assimilated, right? To the point that they don't then have that sort of cultural identity anymore. Thank you, it's a really good question.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for all that. I think we'll wrap up because we're just at the hour now. That was a brilliant overview into a lot of things that we've been thinking about a little bit over the last number of weeks, and I think has really consolidated a lot of those key points and given us a lot of food for thought in terms of how we take this conversation forward as individuals, but I think particularly at an institutional level at Georgetown. There are a number of efforts underway across different schools and centers related to anti-racism in global health, diversity, inclusion and equity, but I think we can try and hopefully move this forward as well in our own spaces too. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Bhattacharyya. This has been a brilliant capstone for this seminar series. Thanks to everyone who's watched online or who will watch this online, and we hope to involve you all in future conversations. So thank you again so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much. This was excellent.